So, Dr. Rah, thank you for joining me here today.
Sure, glad to be here.
I feel like there are a couple different places that we could start this conversation, but I kind of want to ground us in just sort of understanding where we are as the church in the United States. And I feel like I could lay out a basis of like what I mean by that, but I'm kind of
Sure.
curious when I ask the question, where are we as the church in the United States, what sort of a response that conjures up for you?
Yeah, and some of my background in theological education is in history. And so when you're talking specifically about the United States, there is a fairly unique history when it comes to issues of justice. And I'm an evangelism professor, and I look at the way that evangelism has been lived out and practiced in American history. And what you see is that there are places throughout U.S. church history where the actions of evangelism, which is to lead people to Christ and to bring people to a personal relationship with Jesus, very often was connected to acts of justice. And what you see is that throughout US history, up until about the last 100 years or so, we saw the connection between how we speak the gospel and how we live the gospel. So that's why it's kind of unique in US history, because if you look at all of church history, you'll see repeatedly from Acts chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going forward, you'll see repeatedly the church speaking the gospel truth and proclaiming the gospel, but so often balancing that with the demonstration of the gospel. You see that in Acts 15, you see that in Acts 2. And throughout church history, you'll see this over and over again as well. In the early church, for the first 300 years of church history, you see this in the churches in Europe, but you see this in the churches in Africa, the churches in Asia. Throughout the church's history, there has always been this intersection and connection between personal evangelism and social justice. What's unusual about U.S. history is that that's the way it was in 17th, 18th, even into the 19th century. And in fact, 19th century, you saw a direct connection between justice and evangelism. You saw people getting renewed and revived by revival movements, the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and that leading to social transformation and change, especially in the 19th century, where you see abolitionists who saw the injustice and evil of slavery and stood against that out of their deep theological conversion experience. And then you see women's right to vote, the confrontation of child labor laws. All of these things are coming out of the church because people are revived in their faith, their evangelistic experience, their experience of the gospel has transformed them in such a way that they are directing that grace, mercy, justice outward rather than simply inward or towards one another. That was really 1900 years of church history. We saw that. In the last 100 years or so, what we saw was a bifurcation or a divorce of justice and evangelism. And we saw Christians, particularly in the US, decide to step away from the struggles and pains and sufferings in the world and instead focus more on the individual salvation. The world is a wrecked vessel. Let's just save individuals out of that wrecked vessel. What we really care about is personal salvation, individual conversion. We don't care about what happens in the world. So that became the normative approach in American churches for several decades, now coming up on almost a full century of this disconnecting from the world and disconnecting from the pain around the world. I think in the last 25 years, we're beginning to see a resurgence and an interest in how justice can be done. And realizing that evangelism and justice were always the flip side of the same coin. They never should have been separated out, but we have seen that over the last several years in American history.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me that you started there because I have felt that as well, having studied justice. I think a
Yeah,
thing that came up is there is this view that there are the justice people and then there are the evangelism people,
yeah,
to the point that I could feel that I had internalized that as well,
yeah.
having put you, I think, in the justice side of the box with your writings and things like that. And then in prepping for this, finding out that you are a professor of evangelism,
Yeah,
both at Fuller and previously at North Park.
yeah,
So, and like had to realize that for myself of like, I understand that those should be part of the same thing, but even I had still put those two as two separate boxes, basically.
Yeah.
Why did that happen, and why did that maintain for as long as it has?
Well, I write in my books about cultural captivity. And what I mean by that is, and this is an evangelistic, something that's important to evangelism, which is that the gospel has always been couched in culturally relevant terms. And that makes sense, right? I mean, we preach the gospel in language that is understandable. If it's in English, it's in English. If it's in Korean, it's in Korean. And even in cultural language that is understandable. So throughout history, we've always seen that. In fact, that's been the heart of missions, to translate the gospel message, to interpret the gospel message in a way that it is accessible to the receptor culture. And part of that, though, has meant that it went somewhere in, I think, in US history, where it went from relevance of the gospel to a captivity of the gospel. So you see, for example, in American culture, the rise and the focus on this kind of hyper individualism. Right? You see it in the Declaration of Independence, individual liberty, individual freedom. These are very important themes in American history and American politics, American sociology. The hyper individualism is an important theme. We learned that in school. We learned that in our news feed. All of this is an important part of our culture. What happened, though, is that we shaped a gospel message for that hyper individualistic culture in order to be relevant. But then it became a captivity to that narrative of individualism rather than the gospel itself, because the gospel itself is not hyper individualistic. We adapted it to make it relevant to a Americanized Western culture. But the gospel itself is very much communal. It's very much impactful, not just on the individual, but upon society. So my best example of this is that I grew up Southern Baptist and Pentecostal. And growing up Southern Baptist, we had the best youth retreats, and we would have great gospel presentations at youth retreats. And as a youth pastor, I would give the classic Southern Baptist individual sermon, which is, "For God so loves," and I would pick out the worst kid in the youth group, usually an elder's kid or deacon's kid, like the worst kid, and you would point to that kid and say, "Johnny, do you know how much God loves you? Do you know that God died for you, just for you, Johnny?" And just really kind of focus on Johnny coming to individual faith, and of course he does, because I've focused on him, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. I've brought an individual relationship with Christ with this young man that needed the gospel. But unfortunately, that's not really what the passage actually says. The passage doesn't say, "For God so loves Johnny." The passage says, "For God so loves the world," love the world. The Greek word there being cosmos, the word being structures, systems, the cosmos world. That's a corporate language. That's not individual language. But what we've taken a beautiful, rich, complex, layered scriptural passage that is meant for the community to understand how much God loves the world, and reduced it to a hyper individualistic expression. See, we were trying to be relevant to a individual, but in the process, that became more important than the gospel itself and the scriptures themselves. So we want to make sure that individuals come to faith, but if that's all we're focused on, we're deriving our way of doing evangelism not from the scriptures, but from the culture. And so what I describe is that we went from relevancy to a captivity, and a captivity to a hyper individualism. And in the process of becoming captive to hyper individualism, we lost a lot of the scriptural message that talks about structures and systems, and not just individual salvation, but social justice. Those are, again, a part of the biblical message, but because of our cultural captivity, we gravitated towards one side, and it shouldn't be the side, one side of the equation, and ignored the other side of the equation.